At my son's wedding, he announced. From this day forward, she is no longer my mother. The entire hall fell silent. I smiled and said, I wish you happiness in your new life. Before leaving, I handed him an envelope. When he opened it, he began to panic and scream. I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're listening from. I am Helen Carter, 60 years old, living in Nebraska, owner of the 400-acre Carter Farm. Today, I'm in Chicago to witness my only son's wedding. David walked past my table, met my eyes, then looked away as if I were an acquaintance from long ago. His gaze was cold. The MC invited the bride and groom to speak. David stepped onto the stage, holding the microphone as if it granted him control over the entire room. He began smoothly, offering his thanks the radiant bride, the wonderful new family, the bright future ahead. Then suddenly, his voice dropped, the warmth drained out. I'm grateful to the woman who gave birth to me, David said, his eyes locked on mine, unblinking. But today, I choose to close that chapter. I no longer want to be bound by a farm, by the image of poverty and backwardness. She is no longer my mother. A plate clattered from a nearby table. The bride bowed her head, gripping her bouquet tightly. Olivia Whitman, David's mother-in-law, wore a paper-thin smile, polite enough to avoid insult. A murmur rippled through the room. Someone turned to look at me, as if waiting for an explosion. I simply set my glass down and stood up. If you ask whether I was hurt, yes, deeply, furious even. But surprised? Not at all. The path from my table to the stage wasn't long. I walked past satin-covered chairs, the scent of expensive wine, a waiter holding his breath, watching the scene unfold. David stood tall, chin lifted, his hair catching the light. I stopped beside the wedding cake table and pulled a cream-colored envelope from my purse. Congratulations on your new life, David, I said, placing the envelope on the edge of the table, right next to the cake knife engraved with their names. David gave a thin smile. You think you're money? I cut him off. It's not money. I turned away, not watching his reaction. Behind me, chairs creaked softly. The air in the room thickened, as if the air conditioning had suddenly shut off. I walked straight toward the door. A man from the bride's side hurried over, stepping in front of me, voice carefully measured. Mrs. Carter, do you need a doctor? You look... I'm fine, I said. Please let me go. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I pushed the door open. The hallway outside was silent, like a warehouse freshly cleared out, only the hum of the air conditioning and the distant click of someone's heels. I know you can hear me. David's voice came from behind. You don't have to act. I turned, keeping a deliberate distance. You just did what you thought was right, I said. So did I. You came here to cause trouble, he said. You never stop clinging. I came to congratulate you, I replied, and to return what you once gave me. He let out a dry laugh. A moral lesson from someone who doesn't understand the real world? I understand enough, I said. Every world has its rules. Are you threatening me? David leaned back slightly, as if an invisible chair had caught him. I'm not threatening, I said. Just reminding. Olivia appeared, her paper-thin smile still in place, but her eyes calculating. She glanced me up and down, then turned to David. The guests are waiting for the sponsorship signing. Do you want to? David raised his hand, cutting her off. Give me the envelope, he said, voice low. Don't make a scene. I left it on the table, I said. Olivia looked inside and gestured to someone. A staff member ran over with the cream-colored envelope. David snatched it, tearing it open. I watched his hands, not the hands that once held the reins at 13, not the hands with dirt under the nails. These were city hands now, confident, polished, opening the envelope like unlocking a door he was sure was his. He pulled out the papers. His eyes skimmed the first line, then the second. I saw his eyelids twitch, the skin around his mouth go pale. 1 second. 2. No one spoke. Olivia tilted her head to glance at the page, her hand tightening around her clutch until the veins rose. What is this? David rasped, looking up at me, as if trying to drag me back to that small Nebraska kitchen where everything once made sense. I gave you an education, I said. Yet you can't even understand a piece of paper? This can't be, he whispered. You have no right. The elevator doors closed, leaving the distorted sound of music behind. I stood between four steel walls, my hand clutching my purse as if it were evidence in a case. As the floor numbers blinked past, other doors opened in my mind: seasons, faces, the sharp smell of machine oil. To understand how I got here, you'd have to go back to where it all began. A field in Nebraska, when Bill was still alive, when David still ran barefoot through the weeds. Back then, Bill and I built Carter Farm with logic and discipline. The accident happened on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon. Bill was changing the cutting blade under the combine. I heard the harsh clash of metal, then a short cry. By the time I ran out, he was lying still, his hat on the ground beside him. At the hospital, they asked a few questions, filled out some forms, and sent me home. I can't even remember how I drove back. When I got there, David was sitting on the steps, silent. He just looked at me, and I had no idea what to say to him. From that day on, I knew I had to stand on my own. No one else could do it for me. David grew up fast and bright. He loved books, graphs, and spoke of the city as if it were a promise. At the same time, he despised farm life. Once, he complained that his friends teased him. They said I smell like cow manure. That sentence hit heavier than a wet bale of hay. I wiped my hands and said quietly, "You were born from this land, and this land raised you. There's nothing shameful about that." David nodded, but I could see something in him close off. The next day, he sprayed half a bottle of deodorant, washed his shirt twice, and shoved his old rubber boots to the back of the closet. He stopped going out to the fields. I gave him light chores, checking water valves, marking broken fence posts. He finished quickly, set the tools down, and disappeared inside. I didn't force him. Everyone has their own path. When he started college in Chicago, his schedule filled up classes, internships, new friends. His emails were neat, polite, just a few lines. "I'm really busy." I read them and filed them into a folder called Good in my inbox. I didn't blame him. I remembered being young, too, leaving the phone behind when I had to chase a sputtering pump. But the silence stretched and hardened into habit. Calls turned into short texts, then nothing at all. The first time he brought Olivia home, I was hauling a new roll of fencing wire out to the field. The girl wore spotless white shoes, smelled of clean perfume, a strange scent amid the hay and earth. Olivia was polite, asked if I needed help, but one glance at the old wooden walls and chipped enamel counter said enough. David stood between us like a makeshift bridge hastily built between two separate worlds. I brewed coffee and poured it into two chipped mugs. Olivia held hers delicately between two fingers and murmured, "Thank you, ma'am," as if afraid to disturb the air. I wasn't offended. I simply noted the distance. Then one day, he came home without warning. David pulled up in a new car, parking in front of the porch like a customer come to inspect the place. He looked across the yard, glanced at the barn I'd just repainted, then gave me a quick hug shoulder to shoulder. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured coffee. He placed a thin folder in front of me. "You know I've been working in investment these past few years," he began, his voice smooth and polished. "My team's developing a high-tech agricultural model. If we can formalize Carter Farm's paperwork, I can secure better funding. It's just a temporary ownership transfer under my name to reassure the bank. Once the project's done, I'll transfer it back. You'll still have full control over everything on the land." I looked at the folder but didn't open it. "How long is temporary?" "About 12 to 18 months, depending on the funding schedule." He pulled out a page, pointing to the highlighted lines. "See? It's only to make the bank feel secure. I've done this kind of thing for years. No one's touching your land, Mom." "I understand banks," I said. "What about the purpose of use?" "Agriculture, of course. Greenhouses, drip irrigation, moisture sensors, everything clean and transparent." He looked up, his gaze steady. "I just need you to trust me." I'd trusted him many times before, from the day he sounded out his first word to the day he left the farm, but not this time. Because that farm was the life's work Bill and I had built together. I called our family lawyer, Marla Jensen, but her daughter answered, said Marla was caring for her mother in Lincoln and couldn't come right away. Seeing my hesitation, David placed his hand on the table edge. "I promise, once the project succeeds, you'll never have to work another day," he said softly. "You've done more than enough." I signed. The pen pressed into the printed boxes, leaving an ink trail as ordinary as signing for a fertilizer delivery. David closed the folder, hugged me again just as briefly as when he'd arrived. On his way to the car, he turned and said, "I'll make you proud." A few months later, the mail carrier shoved an envelope from the county tax office into my box. I opened it right there on the porch steps. The first line hit me. The registered owner of Carter Farm had changed. I read it again, slower, then again. On paper, everything was tidy: parcel number, acreage, new taxpayer name. No mention of anything temporary. I called David. This time, he answered quickly, the noise of traffic in the background. "I'm in a meeting, Mom. Make it quick." "The ownership on the farm's changed," I said. "The tax notice says so." "Oh, that's just an update delay," he replied smoothly, like reading from a script. "State systems are slow. I've already handled it." "Don't worry." "Did you transfer it all or just part of it?" I asked. "Don't worry," he repeated firmly. "Everything's according to plan. Don't read too much into the paperwork. I'll come home and explain." The call ended because it was meeting time. I held the document, went back to the table, and filed it into a plastic folder. My hand burned hot. That night, I didn't sleep early. I opened the drawers, gathered every scrap of paper bank letters, tax receipts, old contracts. On the yellowed corner of one page was Bill's signature, his handwriting slanted right, like a man stepping forward with purpose. The next morning, I drove to Lincoln. Marla's house sat in a quiet neighborhood. I laid everything in front of her: the folder David brought, the tax letter, everything that might prove I wasn't imagining it. "You want me to look at these now?" Marla asked. "I want to know where I stand," I said. "If I'm overreacting, just tell me." We sat at her dining table, no coffee, no pastries. Marla put on her glasses, flipped through the pages, and marked the verification points with a pencil. She made a few calls to the land office, the county tax department, a contact at the local bank. It took over an hour, maybe two. Finally, she took off her glasses and looked straight at me. "Helen," she said, "David transferred full ownership. There's no temporary clause. The filing is clean, legally airtight. As it stands, the farm is in your son's name." I didn't speak. There are moments when silence is the only sound that feels real. But inside, something broke. My son had truly deceived and betrayed me. Marla turned a page and pointed to a small note. "There is this," she said. "Under intended use, it lists the property as collateral for a real estate project in Chicago. If that's accurate, it violates the verbal agreement about agricultural use. Not a fully binding clause, but with supporting evidence, it gives us leverage." "What should I do now?" I asked. "Emails, texts, any written proof of his original intent and the actual use. Meeting records with his partners. Internal memos, if you can get them. And patience." Marla laid her hand on the stack of papers. "I know you want to throw this whole thing into the open right now, but this has to be done carefully." I nodded. My throat was dry. I gathered my papers, thanked her, and left. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. Every road sign felt like a question: what had my son done, and why? Late that night, David texted, "Mom, don't make this a big deal. I'll have it sorted out by the end of the week." I didn't reply. I opened the barn door, stood in the familiar smell of metal and grease. I placed my hand on the side of the combine, the cool steel seeping into my skin. A steady resolve rose within me. I knew exactly what I would do next. And I knew this much: lies may move fast, but they never go far. On Carter Farm, everything shows its true form after a single season. After the meeting in Lincoln, Marla and I didn't talk much about motives. We focused on drawing a plan strong enough that we wouldn't have to come back later to pick up the pieces. She spread a large sheet of paper on the table and drew 3 columns: what needs to be proven, how to prove it, and when to use it. I looked at the list and saw it clearly. I couldn't rely on the feeling of being betrayed. I needed documents, dates, signatures. The goal was simple: to reclaim ownership of Carter Farm due to deceit in the declared purpose of use. To put it plainly, David had promised one thing and done another. The law gave me a path as long as I walked it right. Marla explained the strategy in short, crisp sentences. We need a moment when he exposes himself. Let his actions trigger the trap. She outlined the mechanism. Prepare a petition asking the court to recognize that the land was used as collateral for a project unrelated to agriculture. Request a temporary order to freeze the property's status, and when the right moment came, file immediately, every move clicking into place like gears in a clock. Timing is everything, she said. Not too early, or he'll find a way to counter it. Not too late, or the damage will spread. One evening, I opened a shared online folder that David had accidentally left public when sending me a link, for fun. Inside were slides for his project, a sample plot outside Chicago, apartment models, floor counts, profit ratios. A financial company's logo sat neatly in the corner. I zoomed in on the final slide and saw the small print. Collateral asset, Carter Farm, Nebraska. I took a screenshot. No need for legal jargon, one picture and one line were enough. I went to the local bank where I'd always deposited the harvest money. The teller was still the same red-haired girl with glasses. I asked for printed statements, especially those tied to David's company. It took several days, but I gathered everything. Transaction records, meeting emails with partners at a Chicago hotel, funding plans with attached maps. After a process as slow and patient as waiting for rain, the file grew thick and heavy like a grain sack ready for storage. That night, with the folder beside my bed, I lay staring up at the wooden ceiling. Sleep came in fits, like water blocked by debris in an irrigation ditch. I didn't want to ruin my son's work, but I couldn't let him grow comfortable painting the word agriculture over something that had nothing to do with it. I remembered Bill's old saying, "Put one piece in the wrong place, and the whole chain breaks." David had placed the family's honor as collateral for a gamble somewhere far away. If I stayed silent, I'd be complicit. Marla called me one morning under a thin veil of clouds. "I think you've got enough to set the trap," she said. "Now it's about timing." She asked, "Does David have any upcoming public event?" I was quiet for a few seconds, glancing at the wall calendar, a red circle around a single date. "Yes," I said. "The wedding, Chicago. Both families and his business partners will be there. They're planning to sign a memorandum during the reception to finalize the funding." Marla paused on the line. "Perfect. When he signs anything financial, that's when we file. The temporary order will freeze all transfers and the bank will step back immediately. He won't have time to use the farm as leverage again." We set the plan. 2 days before the wedding, I'd drive to Lincoln to sign the notarized documents. On the wedding morning, Marla would file electronically with the court and notify the bank handling the loan. At that same moment, I would hand David the hard copy not to ask permission, but to make him face it. "Can you handle the pressure of all those eyes?" Marla asked. I smiled faintly. "There's nothing I can't handle, not if it means protecting Carter Farm." That night, I filled the gas tank, checked the tire pressure, wiped the windshield clean. On the seat beside me lay a cream-colored envelope tucked in my purse, hot to the touch, though invisible to anyone else. I started the car. At the end of the dirt road, I paused for a moment, turned on the headlights, and looked out across the darkened fields. In that darkness lay everything I had to protect. I whispered, not sure to whom, "Here we go." The highway welcomed me with a ribbon of white lights stretching east. I didn't turn on the radio. The engine hummed steadily, like a pump finally cleared of air. I thought about David's face as a boy, running to show me the kite he'd built about that laughter, and how it changed into hurried goodbyes as he grew up. I thought about all the times I folded my sadness like a dishcloth and set it aside to finish the day's work, but not tonight. Tonight, I unfolded it, looked straight at it, and folded it back along a new crease, the crease of a woman setting out to reclaim what's rightfully hers. And every step Marla and I had prepared paid off with pure chaos in that wedding banquet hall. From inside the reception, David's voice carried through the glass wall, muffled like through the walls of a barn. "Get me the account manager. No, right now." I didn't turn back. David stood by the door, phone pressed to his ear, holding the envelope like a piece of baseless evidence. When the bank requested verification, he read the account number. "You can't freeze it today. We have a signing event." A pause on the line. "Why?" He listened, and the color drained from his face. "Who sent the order?" His eyes darted toward the doorway I had just walked through. "I need someone higher up. Connect me." The call was transferred. He switched to speaker, trying to keep his composure. The voice on the line spoke slowly, clipped and clear. "We've received a court order to preserve the current status of assets related to Carter Farm. All transactions using the farm as collateral are temporarily suspended. The risk department has been instructed to close any remaining channels. David kicked the edge of the carpet with his shoe. You're turning a wedding into a joke. We're following the law, the voice replied. He hung up and called his assistant. Get the team together, conference room on the 5th floor now. He rushed to the elevator, jabbing the button repeatedly. When the doors opened, a group of event staff came out pushing a soda cart, nearly colliding with him. Sorry, they said. He didn't answer. When the doors closed again, he caught his reflection in the steel, tie askew, sweat running down his temple. A temporary meeting room had been set up with movable partitions near a side hallway. The assistant pushed a laptop toward him. Email from the bank just came in. David skimmed it, tongue dry. The subject line was short, the content even shorter. Termination of credit agreement. Reason: change of collateral and sudden increase in risk. The chief accountant spoke like swallowing gravel. Without collateral, the main investor will pull out. Another notification flashed across the screen. The secondary partner had temporarily suspended participation. David glanced at his watch. Inside the ballroom, the MC was stalling with a guest name game. The door burst open. Olivia walked in, followed by two men in dark suits with slicked hair. Her voice was cold and measured. You hid this from us? Each word hit the table like a cold coin. David lifted the envelope halfway, then set it back down. We can fix this. It's just, there's no just, one of the partners cut him off. If the collateral's gone, the capital model collapses. We're not taking that risk. The other man placed his business card on the table. We'll reach out if the situation clears up. They left the room as if closing a door behind them forever. Olivia stayed. I invited my people here tonight, she said, slow and sharp. You promised everything was airtight. I don't enjoy being made a spectator to a vanishing act. Give me 2 days, David said. We can substitute the suburban property, or... Olivia gave a thin smile. Do you have any idea how much 2 days will cost us? She tilted her head slightly, lowering her voice. If you pulled my daughter into this with a promise, take that promise back right now. David leaned forward. Your family always talks about trust. This is the time. Trust doesn't replace a signature, Olivia said, turning away. The door shut. Music from the ballroom leaked back in, offbeat and hollow. The assistant hit send on an internal email. Suspend all media activities. Do not issue the press release as planned. David watched a flood of replies pop up. Confirmed. Understood. Requesting urgent meeting. A senior staff member pulled off his name tag and placed it on the table. I'm done. I can't go on with this. David clenched his fists, the knuckles turning white. In the ballroom, the MC announced that guests could head to the lounge for drinks while the bride and groom took photos. In truth, the bride sat pale in the dressing room while her best friend removed her hairpins one by one. What did he say? She whispered, voice thin as thread. He said it'll be fine, her friend answered, not believing it herself. David called the bank again, a different representative this time, calm and detached. I understand your position, sir, but a court order is a court order. Once it's lifted, we'll review your case. He hung up before the word thank you could escape. I sat in a taxi, parked a block from the hotel, watching through the rearview mirror as the glass facade reflected people coming and going like silver fish. The driver asked, Where to, ma'am? I gave him the name of a small riverside hotel. As the car pulled away, my phone buzzed again. Marla. The banks updated the status. The partners asked for clarification on the scope of the order. I've sent the response. Rest now. I closed my eyes not to sleep, just to let my heartbeat settle into the rhythm of an engine running steady. At the Monarch, news began to leak through private chats. A blurry photo circulated, a cream envelope, a man's hand gripping the edge. A caption read, Even finance weddings have their plot twists. A third-tier investor sent an email withdrawing. The closing line, We do not engage in any structure lacking a solid foundation. Foundation. The word didn't belong to those glass towers outside, but I heard it ring, solid and true, like nails driven into the wooden beams of a barn. David returned to the ballroom. The flowers were still fresh, but their stems were bent, petals already falling. Waiters silently replaced glasses. In a corner, two men whispered, watching him with the wary eyes of sailors who had already untied their boats. He stepped onto the stage, reached for the microphone, then let it go. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't ignite the room. Olivia stood by the back door with her daughter. "We're leaving," she said quietly, without looking at him. The bride removed her veil, clutching it to her chest like a leftover prop from a photo shoot. They walked past David as though passing a dead streetlight. A glass fell. The crash echoed red wine spreading like ink. The burnt sugar scent of the wedding cake mixed with alcohol, stinging the air. The remaining guests lined up for their cars, exchanging hollow hugs and polite good lucks. The music stopped entirely. Only the hum of the air conditioning and the drag of fabric on the floor remained. David stood in the center of the room like a man lost in a desert. He looked at the envelope in his hand, fingers pressing the crease until it crumpled. A waiter bent to pick up fallen petals, careful not to touch his shoes. He didn't move. A drop of wine splashed onto his pant leg, spreading into a dark stain. The wedding hall, once dazzling, was now wilted and abandoned. The crystal chandeliers still glowed, illuminating every empty space left behind. David drew in a deep breath, like a man about to dive, then hurled the envelope to the floor. The sound of paper hitting stone mixed with the faint crack of spilled glass. His voice ripped through the soft walls of drapery, dry and sharp. "She destroyed me." The next morning, I woke up in a small hotel overlooking the river, my shoulders heavy as if I'd been hauling a sack of seed. When I unlocked my phone, it was full of unread messages. Photos of the banquet hall in ruins, tablecloths rolled up, the wedding cake half cut. From the hotel lobby, I ordered coffee, sat at a table, and opened my notebook. I wrote down the time, the names of the calls from the night before, and 3 words in bold. Order in effect, a marker in time. While I was writing, Marla called. Her voice was raspy from lack of sleep. The bank had canceled the credit line overnight. The risk department locked down the remaining access points to prevent asset leakage. The main investor had sent a notice of unilateral termination, citing altered risk conditions. "Don't worry about the noise," Marla said. "The essential part is done." I answered simply, "I understand." David went back to his temporary apartment with a head as empty as a barn after harvest. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. The bank asking to confirm the court order, partners asking, "What can we do to save this?" The accountant requesting data for review. After a while, the accountant wrote, "We saw the full scale of the deficit, negative cash flow, short-term debts coming due, tangible assets insufficient to cover losses, and the farm, the main pillar, already pulled away." No words of drama, but each one landed like a block of iron dropped on the table. By noon, there was a brief meeting at Olivia Whitman's private home. Olivia instructed David to suspend all media appearances, ordered the legal team to shut down every channel of information until the family reviewed the matter. The bride sat beside him, eyes swollen, silent. At the end, she removed her wedding ring, twisted it to align with the small notch inside, as if placing an object neatly back into its box, then stood and left with her mother. No argument. That's how the wealthy close a door, quietly, but completely. By early afternoon, local news began to circulate. A downtown wedding unexpectedly halts signing of major investment deal. A few social media accounts posted blurry photos, the wedding table, a man gripping an envelope, the MC standing awkwardly on stage. I placed my phone face down, not because I feared the noise, but because I didn't want it to drown out what still needed to be done. By evening, secondary partners had withdrawn one after another. 2 key staff members sent resignation emails, polite, formal. "Thank you for the opportunity, best of luck." Internal emails turned cold, like an air-conditioned room with a broken thermostat, all words, punctuation, no emotion. That evening, David met with his corporate lawyer. I knew the man. I'd seen him once in a remote meeting. Close-cropped hair, quick talker. But now, his tone was slow, cautious as if each word might turn into evidence. The plan? Dissolution. The simplest, least bloody option among bad ones. File the paperwork. Settle remaining obligations in order. Employee wages, taxes, penalties, then suppliers. Liquidate furniture, terminate the lease early, forfeit the deposit. No jargon, no performance, just a list of tasks to be done, by the book. David's final appointment that day was at a quiet cafe. His assistant brought the office keys, parking card, and a folder. "I'm sorry," the young man said. "I didn't know anything about the farm." David nodded. There was nothing left to argue when the map had already been drawn. They shared a brief handshake. The assistant left first, his empty chair marking where someone had just been. I checked out of the hotel and headed to the bus terminal, buying a ticket for the earliest ride the next morning. Inside me was a mix of exhaustion and relief. I hadn't won last night. I'd merely taken back what was rightfully mine. On the way, I called a neighbor to check the pump, texted the irrigation schedule. Everything at Carter Farm kept running because it had to. That night, I couldn't sleep. I pictured David standing alone by the apartment window. Highway lights streamed endlessly, like irrigation water that never stops if you want the fields to live. His phone must have gone silent, no more replies, no one left to need his promises. Maybe he opened a drawer and realized how little he truly owned. Most of what he had were calendars and emails, things you can't pack in a suitcase. At dawn, a message arrived before I left for the terminal, filed dissolution paperwork. Then a photo of his office desk bare, except for a patch of dust where the computer used to be. Next, a shot of the key return receipt. Looking closer, I could see David's faint reflection in the frame, hair disheveled, tie gone since the night before. I didn't know who took it. Maybe he did. Maybe someone passing by wanted to capture a scene closing itself. By afternoon, a message from one of David's old classmates appeared in my inbox. I don't know how it reached me. Ma'am, he's gone. The final photo showed David standing by the empty apartment doorway, looking out the window toward the flow of traffic. His hand rested on the frame like on a cold piece of wood. The phone lay silent on the table, the screen black. He slipped the key into the landlord's envelope, pressed the seal down carefully with his thumb, and set it on the counter. Then he picked up a suitcase. No one saw him off. The door closed, and the soft click of the lock sounded like a screw turned to its last thread. I put my phone down and looked out the bus station window. Buses lined up, one after another, their dust rising in thin trails. In my mind, I heard the pump at Carter Farm start again, water running steady through the pipes, seeping through the cracks of a dry season. I didn't feel triumphant, only that something had been put back where it belonged. When the lever is pulled away, only what has a foundation can stand. And that foundation, mine, ours, was still there, waiting for me to come home. Carter Farm was finally safe again, back in my hands. And now, it was time to return to the rhythm of ordinary life. Before dawn had fully broken, a fire warning from the county flashed on my phone. Dry west wind, low humidity, no burning of straw. I repeated the same routine I'd kept for years, checking the irrigation gauges, opening each valve one by one so the pressure wouldn't spike, listening to the pump. This morning, the engine sounded a little rough. I unscrewed the cap, wiped away the buildup, greased the fittings, tightened them back down. Water began to flow, dark streaks spreading through the soil like fingers smoothing it calm. The old combine sat in the shed, its back to the door, like a tired ox. I pulled down the ladder and climbed up to inspect the blades. One was chipped, I replaced it and noted in my ledger. Blade #7 replaced. The belt was tight enough, just needed another touch of grease. In the afternoon, I hauled a roll of straw netting to the field's edge. The wind caught it, flinging it into the air. One corner snagged on a post. I bent to free it, my back pulling taut like wire. My vision dimmed for a few seconds. I dropped onto the porch step to let my heartbeat slow. This month's budget was already strained, the pump seal. The new blades hiring help now was a math problem, missing a number. I tilted my head back against the dark wood eave. There was no one to call but myself. When the sun dipped low and the wind shifted, the road dust began to float near the ground. I heard the uneven growl of an engine coming up the drive. A faded silver pickup stopped by the fence. The door opened, and David stepped out. He looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him, loose work shirt, cheap gloves from the hardware store by the highway. He stood at a respectful distance, far enough that neither of us trespassed into the other's space. "I can work day labor," he said, eyes down, as if afraid of an invisible flame. "Pay me the same as anyone else." I didn't show much emotion, but inside, I was both relieved and uneasy. Relieved that he'd come back and offered honest work, uneasy wondering whether he truly valued this place now or had something else in mind. I stood slowly, careful not to let my head spin. "Out here, there's no mom during work hours," I said, "just the boss and the hand." I went inside and returned with the old-time log, a marker, and a faded sheet of safety rules I'd printed years ago. Wear gloves, wear a hat, Stay clear of moving shafts. Cut power before touching machinery. Start time 6 a.m. Finish 7 p.m. half-hour lunch break. Pay on Saturday afternoon. Heavy rain, no work, no pay. Any damage from carelessness deducted at cost. He nodded this time, looking me straight in the eye, not like a man asking a favor, but like one receiving orders. I flipped the book open, wrote his name on the last line, and handed him the pen. His handwriting was stiff and short, nothing like the elegant loops that once adorned his invitation cards. When he was done, he stepped back half a pace. "What should I do first?" he asked. "Tonight, gather the straw along the third ridge," I said. "Clear the small barn, patch the irrigation leak in the north lot, and replace the 2 fence posts that fell. Tools, tape, and fittings are in the shed. Bring water the windle, dry your throat fast. If the pump sounds off, call me." "Got it," he said. I handed him an old baseball cap. "Wear it. The sun'll drain you quicker than you think." He took it without a thank you, but I saw how tightly his hand gripped the brim. He walked toward the grass line, shoulders slightly hunched against the wind. I didn't watch long. I went back inside, taped the crack in my hand, drank some water, then checked the supply list again. Added a new line. "New hand teach pump operation." About an hour later, I heard the sounds, the hose being dragged, the click of a clamp, a hiss of air, then the even run of water. When I stepped out, David was kneeling, left hand steadying the pipe, right hand wrapping tape around the joint. He did it right, not too tight to split the plastic, not too loose to leak. I stood a few yards away, letting him know I was watching without stepping in. He looked up, a clean streak of sweat cutting through the dust on his cheek. "That section's good," I said. "Check it again once pressure builds." "The third ridge done yet?" "Half," he answered. "Winds kicking up, straws flying." "Find the small mesh by the post pile," I told him. "Tie it back at stake, 10 west windle, flatten it down." He nodded, walking toward the shed faster than when he'd arrived. The sun dropped lower, the barn's shadow stretching almost to the line of poplars. I began shutting off the unnecessary valves, keeping one line running low overnight, just enough to keep the soil from cracking. Cicadas buzzed from the ditch, a steady fabric of sound. David passed by carrying a bundle of straw on his shoulder, slim frame, sure steps. No apologies, no explanations. Just breath, rhythm, and motion, as if he were counting each step against the days gone by. I handed him a long flashlight. "When dusk comes, check the third ridge again. Straw by the fence catches fire easy. If you see cigarette ash, cover it with dirt." He took it, flicked it on the beam, slicing through the dust. Darkness came down like a closing door. I reviewed the logbook. Valves locked, pump steady, tomorrow's list neatly itemized. I shut the lights in the big shed, leaving only the porch lamp glowing faintly outside. David moved slowly along the ridge, flashlight beams sweeping across grass, loose straw, a discarded aluminum can. He bent to pick it up and slipped it into his pocket. When he finished, I pointed toward the small shed by the south boundary. "That's the day labor room. Bunk bed fan, water's in the jug in the corner, dinner's in a box on the table. Be at the pump by 6. He nodded, not glancing toward the main house. I didn't invite him in. Familiarity has to travel with responsibility, and responsibility takes time. I woke before dawn, when the sky was still a thin streak of gray. The porch light had just come on, casting my shadow at an angle across the concrete yard. The first task was to check the pipes. Open the small valve to release air. Listen as the hiss softened. Watch the pressure gauge as the needle rose and settled. Touch the joints to feel for leaks. I greased the pump bearings, turned the lever a few times to spread it evenly. Then I started the motor and stood still for a full minute to listen. Steady hum, no screech, no rattle. David came out of the labor shed right on time. His eyes were shadowed from the hot night, but his movements were crisp. I gave him short instructions. Pull the dry grass from the south ridge into the barn, then check the auxiliary pump belt in the north lot. He nodded. No, yes ma'am, no excuses. I handed him a thicker pair of gloves. The old kind will blister your hands. By noon, blisters had already formed across his palms, puffy, raw with moisture. He didn't complain, just wrapped his hands tight with fabric tape and kept hauling bales. The days fell into rhythm repetition, steady as physical therapy. Pull, gather, stack, check the fence, drive in more posts, clear the drainage trench, end the day at the pump. I kept my distance. Assignments went on the whiteboard, signatures in the evening, tasks crossed off line by line. I didn't ask how he was doing, didn't bring up the wedding night. Dinner was always waiting. Heated canned meat, baked potatoes, a glass of milk. The clink of a knife against a plate was the only sound. When he finished, he washed his dishes, set them to dry, wiped the table, and went back to the shed. We each held on to our silence like water in a barrel, careful not to spill a drop. On the 5th day, a pipe burst. A dry pop followed by a spray of water. I ran over and saw the main valve wide open, and the end valve still shut. David stepped on the hose to block the stream, twisted the end valve open, but too late the joint had blown, the hose split. He looked at me, breathing hard. I closed them in the wrong order, he said at once. I'll replace it, deduct it from my pay. I handed him the parts box and stood aside. He cut the damaged section, fitted the coupler, tightened the clamp, and opened the valves first, middle, last. Water ran smooth again, the pressure needle back in the green. Next time, check twice, I said simply. That evening, in the machine shed, the smell of oil and metal shortened sentences. I was wiping a blade clean. David sat across from me, hands on his knees. He began to talk, haltingly, as if unscrewing bolts that had been over-tightened. At the firm, people talk about where you come from like it's something you're supposed to overcome. I kept worrying someone would smell the dirt still on my clothes. He gave a small, soundless laugh. The Whitneys, my ex-wife's family, they had their own standards. I wanted in, whatever it cost. I wanted to keep my place once I got there. He exhaled. I knew the legal risks. I knew the fine print. But I dressed up the loan file, polished over the weak joints, used Carter Farm as leverage against the promise I made. I thought if I got through one season, everything would level out. I was wrong. I didn't play the judge. I set the blade into its tray and said quietly, "Out here, if you grease the wrong bearing, the whole drive seizes up. No coat of paint can save it." He nodded. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the insects beyond the wooden wall. The next day, David handed me a piece of paper, handwritten, neat, plain, internal agreement. I waive any and all claims to ownership or usage rights concerning Carter Farm, present or future. I accept a temporary labor position until the end of the season. I will follow all safety and operational regulations. Signed, I looked at his signature, then at his eyes. No pleading in either. I folded the paper, went into the house, opened the safe, and placed it in the tray labeled Family Documents. After closing it, I turned and said, "This afternoon, you'll handle the fuel inventory." By late evening, the wind had shifted hot as an oven. A cigarette ember from the straw field caught in the grass and flared into a red line. David was on the second ridge. The moment he saw smoke, he ran. He grabbed the small fire hose by the shed, opened the auxiliary valve, dragged the line straight, and sprayed the base of the flames. Sparks leapt, smoke whipped across his face with the wind. Neighbors heard the alarm and came running, one with a shovel throwing dirt, another with a spray canister. I carried more water, throwing it along the edge to keep the fire from spreading through the scattered straw. A minute passed. 2. The flames sputtered, died down. The smoke thinned, leaving only that sharp, burned smell clinging to the air. David set the hose down, coughing, sweat streaking his neck. He looked toward me, waiting for instruction. I stepped closer, placed a hand on his shoulder, just a touch, not a grip. "Your night shift lead," I said quietly. "I'll check the north boundary. Call if anything changes." He nodded, lifted the hose again, checked the fittings, cleared the burned patch, dragged the wet straw away. For the first time since he'd come back, I left him a stretch of ground without my shadow beside it. Late that night, the wind eased. When I returned to the machine shed, David was crouched by the second pump, lid off, cleaning out the residue. He replaced the seal, tightened the bolts, greased the housing. The motor sputtered once, twice, then steadied. After a day like that, the sound of the engine running was like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again after too much strain. He didn't cheer. He just sat back on the concrete floor, leaning against an old ammo crate, head tilted toward the open door. The night sky was black and full of stars, tiny holes in a stretched tarp, letting in small streams of cool air. I stood at the doorway, not stepping in. "Tomorrow we start at 5:30, I said. While the wind's still soft, he turned his head, nodded. I dimmed the lights, leaving a single bulb glowing. Out on the porch, I paused, listening to the pump's steady rhythm in the dark. Some things speak only in sound, an apology that never finds its words, and an acceptance that doesn't need a signature. The morning after the fire was put out, I met Marla at her small office in a quiet neighborhood near the county courthouse. I brought a notebook, a few receipts, and the handwritten pledge David had given me. When we sat down, I spoke plainly. I don't want Carter Farm ever turned into leverage again. Help me lock the door properly. Marla opened a new file, laid a pencil across the page, and waited. I want to establish a trust for the farm, I said. Clear, simple, no loopholes. Marla nodded. She explained in short, crisp sentences enough to follow without drifting. A trust is a legal mechanism in which property, in this case, Carter Farm, is placed inside a box with a lock. The lock is the rule book. The trustee holds the key. The beneficiary can only use what's inside according to those rules and cannot take the box out and pawn it. Practically speaking, she concluded, you'll retain control over how the land is used, and any heir cannot use it as collateral for speculation. I need the rules spelled out, I said. The land is for farming sustainable, no tricks. Marla wrote quickly, her pen moving fast. We went over the clauses together. Water conservation, crop rotation, no chemical overuse, a cyclical soil preservation plan. Major decisions selling equipment, changing crop structure would require an annual independent audit, reports shared with both family and attorney, so no one could later claim, I didn't know. If anyone violates the rules, I added, their benefits are suspended. Marla added language about suspension procedures, paths to reinstatement, and ultimate authority resting with the trust's founder during her lifetime. I read the words "during her lifetime" and felt a small weight lift. At least as long as I breathed, the key would stay in my hand. Then came the part about David. If he wants to be involved, I said, he needs a path, but one that slopes uphill. Marla asked, what do you have in mind? I listed it out. Enroll in the local farm management program. Complete the required seasonal field hours. Pass safety certifications for machinery and chemicals. Attend the annual audit meetings. Submit a short report on his work, signed and accountable. It's not to punish him, I added. It's to make him understand what keeps the machine running. Marla repeated it aloud as she typed it into the bylaws. After successfully completing all requirements, David could be considered for a management role with clearly defined rights and limits. I asked David to come to Marla's office at 3 o'clock. He arrived on time-clean work shirt, close-cropped hair. Marla slid the draft toward him. Read it all, I said. Ask if anything's unclear. He sat silently, turning the pages, lips pressed tight. When he reached the audit section, he looked up. Who's the independent auditor? Marla gave him a list of 3 firms in the state and explained the costs and reporting process. Where does the funding come from? He asked. From the operations fund, I said. It's built into the season's budget. He nodded. When he reached the clause, no mortgaging, no using as leverage, he read more slowly, as if letting the words carve themselves into his hand. What happens if it's broken? He asked. The benefits are suspended, I said. And depending on the severity, the role can be revoked. He didn't respond, just kept reading. When he reached the page titled David's Pathway, he leaned back in his chair and looked straight at me. How long is the farm management course? 1 year, I said. Seasonal practice included. At the end, a safety exam. Fail it, you repeat. He nodded. I used to be used to boardrooms, he said quietly. Getting used to grease and oil again doesn't sound so bad. Marla handed him a pen. If you find this acceptable, sign the marked pages. David signed the page titled Pledge of No Collateral or Financial Leverage. Then the page Violation Procedures. Then Acceptance of Audit Mechanisms. No but followed any signature. When he reached the final page, he asked, For the public report, where do you want it posted? 1 printed copy at the house, I said. 1 emailed to the family. 1 filed with the attorney, enough so no one forgets. After leaving the office, we stopped by the town church to borrow the small meeting room. I invited a few key neighbors, the Browns on the West Ridge, the young couple from the southern lot, and the old man who oversaw the shared pump station. I told them about the trust, the commitment to shared irrigation schedules, the quarterly maintenance plan for the main pipeline. Nothing changes for you, I said. It just means everything's now on paper, so when I'm gone, the next person can still walk the same path. The old pump man nodded. Best thing about paper, he said, is when there's an argument, you read it instead of yelling. Everyone agreed. No one asked for anything more than, just don't let the water run late. David sat a row behind, taking notes. When the meeting ended, I handed him the new schedule: warehouse inventory, fuel log updates, equipment maintenance by running hours. This is the backbone work, I said. Not glamorous, but if it fails, the whole system stops. He held the paper like a pass through a new gate. Understood, he said. By late afternoon, we returned to Marla's office to sign the final copies. She took a blue binder, placed the originals inside, gave me a stamped copy, and kept one for her records. When I signed the last line, Marla closed the binder. The click of the clasp sounded complete. Now Carter Farm has the right kind of lock, she said. It doesn't lock people out, it locks shortcuts. I ran my hand lightly along the binder's edge. It felt like tightening a bolt to just the right tension, not loose, not forced. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the parking lot was dusty, the sun striking the pavement in small explosions of heat. Pickup trucks came and went, hauling ladders, pipes, and toolboxes, an ordinary county afternoon. But the horizon looked steadier now. Out there lay a piece of land finally fastened at the right knot. And here an old woman signing her last stack of papers, exhaling evenly, thinking, it's my turn to rest my arms on the porch rail, so the next generation, if they choose, can keep walking without needing to build a bridge out of scraps. The rain came exactly one night after I signed the final papers at Marla's office. Not a storm, not a downpour, just steady, patient rain, as if someone were standing on the porch, pouring bucket after bucket over the hot earth. By morning, the fields had deepened in color. Months of dust finally rinsed from the leaves. I turned on the pump at low pressure, letting the rainwater and tank water soak in together, nothing wasted. The combine started its run, its engine humming evenly like an old hand who knows how to pace himself. I logged the yield by section: north lot, middle lot, the strip by the barn. David stood at the end of the lane, directing the small trucks, gestures sharp, voice clear, never lost beneath the machinery's noise. He'd learned the habits of the drivers who'd come here for years, who was quick, who was careful, who always forgot to lower the tarp. I didn't have to remind him. The granary filled steadily, the faint scent of freshly dried grain, dry but rich. I wrote down the day's loads and added one note in the corner: rain, right on time. It wasn't for record keeping, just a simple thank you for something beyond control. David leaned through the doorway to report that the afternoon run was organized and the last truck would leave before the sun dropped low. I nodded, clipped my pen back into the notebook, and poured us both some water. That weekend, the town held its annual harvest festival. The Carter Farm booth wasn't flashy. Rows of fresh corn, bags of freshly milled flour, a few large photographs of the fields this season. Familiar faces stopped by asking about the drought, about whether the old harvester still ran, asking David how he liked the day labor. He only smiled and said, plenty to do. A couple visiting from out of state lingered longer, complimenting the photos and asking if we'd ever considered opening the farm for tours, let children come and learn. I thanked them, then explained that the trust had already set its purpose. The land stays for production, not display. We might host the occasional volunteer day, but we don't sell tickets. They looked a little surprised, then nodded, wishing us a strong season. As I spoke, I felt something steady inside me, like the straight line of a plow through even soil. Saying no didn't erase goodwill, it simply kept us on course. After the festival, the post office left an envelope on my porch. Inside was a card, written in neat hand, an apology from David's ex-wife. She wrote that she regretted letting her family apply pressure, wished us both peace, hoped that if we ever crossed paths again, we'd nod politely instead of turning away. I read the card twice. There was nothing to answer, not out of bitterness, but because some things are already settled by action. I slipped the card into my notebook titled Things Not to Forget and closed it. Temptation doesn't vanish just because one season goes well. The next week, a brokerage firm emailed an offer to buy a corner of the farmland near where the county planned to extend the new road. Their price was far above market. David brought the email into the kitchen and set it beside the coffee pot. I compared it with the trust's terms, he said. Short-term profit isn't within scope. Selling that corner would cut the Northfield's water flow, force us to redesign the irrigation, increase costs, and disrupt rotation. And more importantly, the trust prohibits transfers for speculative gain. He handed me a draft of the reply, concise, polite, quoting the exact clause. I nodded and pushed the paper back toward him. Send it. The lock Marla and I had installed was beginning to make its own sound whenever someone touched it the wrong way. Late one still afternoon, we sat on the wooden porch. The fields before us blazed gold, bright enough to make our eyes squint to see their edges. The air smelled of dry haylight and sweet. David brought out 2 glasses of water, set them down without a coaster. He talked about continuing his management course, about the first meeting of the Young Farmers Club in the county, how they shared ways to collect rainwater for dry seasons. We could use the big barn roof, he said, install gutters, run it into a holding tank, add a leaf filter. I listened, without interrupting with any back-in-my-day stories. The young need room to adjust the old patterns to fit their own time. What's the budget plan? I asked. He handed me a handwritten sheet materials, labor hours, installation dates, each line straight, nothing half-finished. In the living room, I hung a small family photo on the wall by the window. Bill sitting on the old tractor, hat tilted over one eye, me beside him, holding a small David who hadn't yet learned to complain about the smell of dirt. Next to it, a new photo from this season, David and me in front of the freshly painted barn, fences straight, the new water tank dark and reflective, the sky's faint reflection rippling across its surface. 4 people across 2 photos, all looking straight into the camera with the same quiet firmness that doesn't need to raise its chin to be sure of itself. I sat at the table and opened my notebook. The annual audit date was circled in red. Below it, next year's rotation plan. Corn on the north lot, wheat moved to the middle, soybeans tested on the lighter soil by the edge. A list followed sustainable supplies, efficient sprinklers, spare bolts, quality belts, thick gloves. At the very bottom, I added one last line. Remember to open the small valve first, then the main one. That note was for me as much as for David, a reminder that every breakdown starts with something small overlooked. Outside, the sun slid behind the row of poplars, stretching our shadows across the porch floor. The hum of insects laid a soft fabric over the yard. At the pump, the motor purred steadily even, quiet, no rattle, no squeal. David stood, saying he'd check the distant lines again tonight and tidy the fuel shed. I told him to take the new flashlight, the white beam one that made it easier to spot stray embers. He nodded, took it, and crossed the yard with an easy, familiar gait, no longer rushed, no longer hesitant. I rose and stepped down into the main shed. The smells, oil, steel, dry wood wove together into something anyone who'd lived here long enough would recognize anywhere. I ran my hand along the machine's frame, cool to the touch, and I thought, the land forgives when people learn to fix what they've broken. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's correcting the wrong part and moving forward. I slid the barn door closed, latched it. The darkness inside softened as the porch light came on, spilling warm gold across the floor. From the porch, the fields no longer blazed, they glowed, calm and deep, like cloth freshly washed and hung in the right wind. I sat on the wooden chair and listened. Somewhere, a late bird shifted branches. Somewhere else, a metal drum cooled and clicked once. Here, my heart beat steady, its rhythm matching the pump's hum. A true beginning doesn't need a ribbon cutting, just a day that ends in order, a morning waiting with work to do, a stream to open, and someone to call awake while the sky is still gray. I lifted my glass, took a sip, the cool tracing down my tongue. Then I turned off the porch light, left a small glow to guide the way, and stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The story you just heard is a work of fiction, yet every line, every breath of Helen Carter carries the echoes of real people, those betrayed by their own blood, stripped not only of what they owned, but of their dignity, who still found the strength to stand again amid the ashes of broken trust. Names and details have been changed to protect the identities of those who might be recognized. We tell this story not to glorify revenge, but to remind you that sometimes justice doesn't come from a gunshot or a courtroom. It comes from the courage to hold on to what's right in a world that's lost its way. For Helen, revenge wasn't destruction. It was rebuilding brick by brick with the very hands others had dismissed. If you've ever had something you built torn from you, if you've ever been forced into silence among lies, remember this. Your silence is not the end. It's the pause before a steadier step forward. Leave a comment if you believe that persistence, quiet, patient, unwavering, is the most powerful form of revenge. And if you believe that true justice means continuing to live, to protect what's right even when no one else stands with you, share this story. Someone out there might need proof that endurance can outlast betrayal. Don't forget to subscribe, because here, every story is a testament that fairness isn't some distant idea. It's something planted and tended by those who refuse to yield. On the final screen, we'll leave you with 2 more stories of people who have walked through ruin and learned to turn their loss into a new foundation. I promise you won't just watch, you'll feel it.